This happened about 6 months ago, during an overnight trip to the Superstition Mountains, which are about an hour east of Phoenix. I'm not going to reveal the exact trail, because I've had enough experience to know that when you post anything online, a beautiful trail, an abandoned mine, a spooky story, people flock to it, often bringing trash and loud music. This trail was an 8-mile loop through a canyon, fairly straightforward for an overnight trip. I was originally supposed to go with a friend, but he bailed at the last minute, leaving me to go alone. With my pack already ready and my car loaded, I decided to go anyway. However, because I left home late and had a hard time navigating the rough forest roads, I didn't get to the trailhead until about 5:45 p.m., a very inadvisable time for anyone who hikes regularly. I had about 4 miles to go to my intended campsite, and it was getting dark fast. I figured if I moved quickly, I could get 2 to 3 miles in before having to find a place to stop. This strategy led me to be hiking in the pitch black, completely alone, with about 15 miles of dirt road separating me from anyone else. Hiking in the dark is scary enough, especially in a place like this. Eventually, it got so dark that all I could see was what my headlamp illuminated. I decided to stop and set up camp. With only my headlamp for light and a need to move quickly, I chose a less than ideal spot. There were some burnt pieces of wood and remnants of an old fire ring, which suggested that someone had been there before, but definitely not recently. My first priority was to get a fire going. I surveyed the area and found some dead wood and quickly got a good fire started. I set up my tarp, opened a can of chili mac that I had brought, and was very much looking forward to eating it. At this point, I was feeling pretty good. My camp was set up, food was warming over the fire, and the uneasy feeling from hiking in the dark was almost gone, though a little bit of anxiety, which is normal when camping alone in a secluded area, remained. To understand what happened next, I need to describe my camp setup. The spot I chose was a small clearing, surrounded by large ponderosa pine trees, with a trail about 30 feet to my left. When you're in the woods and have a fire going, the light from the fire creates a halo of light around you, and everything outside the perimeter of that light is pitch black. I was sitting on the ground next to the fire, eating my dinner, when a small rock, about the size of a marble, was suddenly thrown into my camp. I looked at the rock, stunned, as I was certain I was the only person on that trail that night. I immediately flicked on my headlamp and shined it in the direction the rock came from, but due to the dense pine forest and underbrush, I could only see about 10 feet. For the next 15 minutes, I was in a state of disbelief, constantly sweeping my light through the surrounding trees, looking for anyone or anything that would have thrown that rock, but not daring to go too far from the fire, which in hindsight provided only a false sense of security. After sitting back down and trying to calm myself, I convinced myself that maybe I had accidentally kicked the rock or that it had fallen from a tree. I went to bed that night, not knowing that the real horror was about to begin. I was awoken by a rustling of leaves, very faint, almost inaudible if I wasn't listening closely, but was there. Still in a semi-dream state, I listened as the rustling faded, as if something was moving away. I reached for the handheld flashlight that I had placed next to me before I went to sleep, but the more I looked, the more panicked I got as I realized it was no longer there. I scrambled to get out of my sleeping bag, out from under my tarp, and looked around. I saw a light in the woods, no more than 15 feet away. It was my flashlight, sitting on a pile of leaves. This was one of the few moments in my life where I almost lost control and had a full-blown panic attack. The flashlight that I had placed right next to me was now 15 feet away, in the woods, through the trees. I quickly put on my shoes, knife in hand, my mind racing. I considered my options: stay in my camp and wait for morning, or try to hike the 3 miles back to my car in the dark. I figured that whatever or whoever was out there would have the advantage if I was on the trail without a light, so I decided to stay. Eventually, the noise came back. I heard footsteps in the woods, distant but distinct, as if someone was just casually walking around with not a care in the world. Every now and then, the footsteps would fade as they got too far away, but then an hour or two later, they would come back, just as faint as before. This went on for 3 to 4 hours, until the footsteps came closer, about 7 feet away from me. At this point, my fire had died down significantly because I had run out of wood. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, and it was completely silent. I sat there for 2 hours, gripping my knife, praying that I wouldn't hear another sound. I stayed in that position until the sunlight started to come through, enough for me to see that I was completely alone in my camp. I quickly packed up my stuff and hiked the 3 miles back to the dirt road where my car was parked. I practically ran to my Subaru, unlocked it, jumped in, and drove away, not stopping until I was at least 20 miles from the spot. I pulled over at a gas station in Apache Junction to get a Red Bull, but mostly just to see and talk to another person. When I left the store, I saw something written in the dust on the back window of my car. Sleep well. A lot of weird things have happened to me on my adventures throughout Arizona, but this was by far the weirdest and most terrifying. There is a truly abnormal person living in the Superstition Mountains, and my advice is to stay as far away from there as you can. This incident happened when I was 14 years old, during a camping trip on a small plot of land in western Maryland, where my maternal family owned several cabins. It's a secluded, private area, and everyone on this mountain is related to us in some way. We grew up with summers spent around bonfires, telling spooky stories and running around with our cousins. To give you an idea of the layout, the area has a main road shaped like a big T. At the top of the T, about 150 feet away, is the Savage River. If you turn left on the T, you'll pass several family cabins interspersed with dense woods that cut across the road. If you go all the way to the right side of the T, you'll get to my mom's small cabin, where we were staying. I usually like to go for walks alone, and that's what I intended to do that day, until my aunt asked to come along. She's 14 years older than me, young at heart, with pink hair and lots of tattoos, almost 6 feet tall, not the type to be easily intimidated. She wanted to come along to smoke weed out of sight of my grandmother, who disapproved. I was a good kid, and even though she offered, I declined, scared of drugs. We went to the left side of the T, into the dense woods, with the river still about 150 feet away. Off the end of the road, there's a rough dirt path that leads into the woods, and if you head towards the river, the terrain slopes downwards. A few miles in, you'll come across one of those mysterious staircases that lead to nowhere, which I later learned was a legend. That day, I followed the path and went down to the area near the river, watching fish and crawdads swim by, while my aunt trailed behind me, smoking and high as a kite. I was lost in my own world when a click sound pulled me back to reality. I looked up, confused, and my eyes landed on a strange man standing on the other side of the river, no more than 15 feet away from me. He seemed to have just emerged from the woods on the other side. Despite it being summer, he was wearing a black jacket and torn jeans, holding a cheap yellow camera, the non-digital kind where you have to wind it to take the next picture. I was stunned because I had never seen anyone outside of my family in this area in all the years I had been coming here. He smiled at me, then slowly raised the camera. He looked to be in his 40s, unkempt, tall, and skinny. He took one step forward, and I took one step back. He wound the camera again and pointed it at me. I was speechless, just taking another step back, almost tripping on a rock. At this point, my aunt stumbled out from the bushes mid-sentence about how high she was and stopped, staring at the man. I turned to her, frozen like a deer in headlights. I slowly turned back, and he was still looking at me, not her. He clicked the camera again, then did something that made my blood run cold. He wagged his finger in a tut-tut-tut motion, pointed to a sheath on his hip, and then made a slicing motion across his throat. I immediately went into autopilot. I spun around, grabbed my aunt, and tore through the bushes, my heart pounding. I heard another click, followed by a splashing sound from behind. My legs were shaking so much I almost collapsed. The river at this spot is only thigh deep for an adult, so I knew he could easily follow. We ran like crazy, and when we saw the mysterious staircase, my aunt pulled me to the other side, sliding down to take cover. I was gasping for air, covering my mouth to stay quiet. I looked around, but the woods were too dense to see the river. However, even with my pounding heart, I heard branches cracking, as if someone was crashing through the woods. I was terrified. The way back to our family's plot wasn't a straight path. It was winding and rough, with jagged rocks that could easily twist an ankle or cause you to run into a tree. I ran and cried, worried because this area is known for its many snakes. My aunt and I kept running, but after about a mile, I tripped, hitting my head on a tree and biting through my lip. I fell, bleeding and disoriented. My aunt came back, kneeling in front of me, whispering over and over that we had to keep running. It was about 1.5 miles more to our family's plot, and another 2 miles to my grandmother's occupied cabin. My ears were ringing, and I wasn't paying attention to her pleas. I kept looking back, but saw nothing. She decided not to waste any more time on me, pulled me up and dragged me along. I limped after her, and everything became a blur until we burst out of the woods. Most of the family wasn't there at the time, so we only stopped once we got to my grandmother's house. I burst inside, sobbing uncontrollably. Nobody locks their doors here, and my grandmother looked at me and my aunt in horror, calling my grandfather. He immediately grabbed his rifle, and while my aunt recounted the story, leaving out the part about her being high, he and my grandmother went from cabin to cabin, gathering the men and their guns, and warning the women and children about what had happened. There's no cell service here, so calling the police wasn't an option. Besides, it would take the police over an hour to get up the mountain, and it was getting dark. The road up the mountain is winding and steep, and no one would dare drive it in the dark. Eventually, my mom heard the news and came over. She looked at my aunt and assumed I must have smoked with her, making us paranoid about a lost fisherman and scaring ourselves. She also said I could have imagined him taking pictures or chasing us. My aunt got angry, screaming that I was a good kid who had done nothing wrong and that we were telling the truth. They got into a heated argument until my grandmother told them both to stop and be adults. Even though the men in the family searched the woods, they found no trace of the man. That night, for the first time in a long time, everyone on the mountain locked their doors. To this day, I still wonder if I am part of some weird photo collection. But thinking about what could have happened if I had gone alone as I usually did, I'm okay with living with that memory. In 1998, an old friend invited me to go camping with him. I hadn't been camping since I was 12, so I agreed, thinking it would be a fun experience. For the entire week leading up to the trip, I was so excited that I lost sleep the night before. He picked me up a little after 5 a.m., and we drove 100 miles to the park. I managed to get some sleep in the car, so when we arrived, I felt a little better. However, my friend then dropped the bombshell that we had to hike 2 more hours to get to the campsite. I tried to convince him to choose a closer spot, but he insisted that I would love the place once we got there. With a heavy heart, I reluctantly followed. The first half an hour wasn't bad, mostly downhill. But the farther we went, the more tired and sluggish I became. About halfway through, we took a break, then continued our journey. The next section was mostly uphill, and it wasn't long before I was sluggish again, not paying attention to where I was going. When we reached a flat part of the trail, I felt a sense of relief. My friend was ahead of me and didn't notice the trap, but I wasn't so lucky. One moment I was walking normally, and the next I was falling. I landed in a hole, hitting the bottom hard enough to snap me back to full consciousness. The adrenaline rush masked most of the pain. When I tried to stand up, my right leg buckled, and I fell back down, impaling myself on a pointed stake that was set up at the bottom of the hole. Luckily, there were several other stakes, but they had broken off. Looking down, I saw that the bone in my right leg was protruding. My first instinct was to pull the stake out of my leg, and the pain that came with it made me dizzy and sick to my stomach. I looked up to see where I was, only to see the blue sky framed by trees. The hole was about 10 feet deep or more, and it must have taken days to dig. I called out to my friend, and he appeared at the top of the hole, at first laughing. But when I told him about the injury, the smile vanished, replaced by a look of sheer panic. He said it looked like a group of poachers had dug the hole, probably for a bear trap. I thought he could just pull me out, but he couldn't. He tried to use a tree branch, but when I tried to stand, the pain was too much, and I couldn't put any weight on my leg. It was clear that I wasn't going to get out on my own without help. Since it was still early, I wasn't too worried. I could hear my friend pacing frantically at the top of the hole, so I called up to him in a calm voice and told him to go get help. The ranger station was just over an hour away, so he should be able to make it back before it got dark. As he left, I was alone with just the pain. The pain came in waves, accompanied by bouts of nausea. I tried to fashion a splint, but the moment I tightened it, I almost passed out, so I decided to leave it alone. I put my head between my knees, waiting for the dizziness to pass. Eventually, I tried to focus on other things, singing to distract myself, but then the thunder started. The sky began to darken. The rain started to fall, at first a light drizzle, but within minutes it was coming down in sheets. I was fine until I realized the hole was starting to flood. The water was already up to my feet, and I realized I was in danger. I tried to crawl up the side of the hole, standing as much as I could, praying for the rain to stop. After an hour, the rain subsided, and the water was only up to my mid-calves. I figured if it kept up like this, help would arrive before the water got any higher. But that was just a brief reprieve. Soon, the rain came down even harder. The only positive thing was that it took my mind off the pain in my leg. I tried to stay positive, thinking about funny jokes and movies. But the next hour was the longest of my life. When help finally arrived, the rain had almost stopped. The water in the hole was up to my waist. They used a rope to pull me out. The thought of almost drowning in a small hole in the middle of nowhere still gives me the chills. Once I was out, things moved fast. I was taken to the hospital, where I had to have surgery to get some screws and a metal plate put in my leg. I went home afterward, but I was on crutches for the next 8 weeks. We never went back to make up for the canceled trip. Still, over the years, I've taken my kids camping a few times. I just make sure to keep a closer eye on them this time. Recently, I've been thinking about calling that friend again. We haven't seen each other in years, and a camping trip might be a great way to reconnect. My childhood was anything but easy. Besides enduring constant beatings, my parents were largely absent. Both were alcoholics. My mother only worked part-time, claiming it was so she could take care of me. But in reality, she spent most of her free time drinking or in bed. My father was the main breadwinner, a long-haul truck driver who was often away, leaving me to fend for myself. Our apartment was on the edge of town, surrounded by endless woods. From a very young age, I was fascinated by those woods. It wasn't long before I started spending my days exploring them, and my love for nature grew from there. I soon realized that my parents didn't care where I was or what I was doing, so I started experimenting with camping overnight in the woods, wanting to see if anyone would even notice I was gone. As I expected, no one cared. From then on, I started spending weeks at a time camping in the vast forest. But all good things must come to an end. One morning, as I was walking out of the woods, my father caught me. He had just returned from a long trip. It was 5 a.m. on a school day, and he was furious to see his 12-year-old son emerging from the woods. Besides getting a beating, I was berated. But that didn't stop me from going back. After laying low around town for a week, I waited for my father to leave and for my mother to drink herself to sleep. Then I escaped back to the woods, my real home. Every morning before school, I would sneak back without anyone knowing. Soon, it was back to normal. If I wasn't in school, I was wandering the woods. I had several campsites scattered throughout the forest. But before long, I realized I wasn't the only one out there. There were groups of homeless people who had probably been there long before I arrived. They used the woods as a place to camp and drink, away from the prying eyes of the police and the general public. Once, I made the mistake of staying in one spot for too long and was almost attacked. After that, I moved my campsites to the other side of the river. There were nights when I would sneak through the dark, watching them self-destruct on drugs and alcohol. Several times, violence would erupt, which only cemented my hatred for them. I had seen enough of that at home. As the months went on, I ventured deeper into the vast forest, always looking for new places to explore. Summer came, and with it, more homeless people. Before long, they had cluttered camps everywhere. Still, I was safe on the other side of the river, a crossing only I knew how to make. But my paradise was finally taken from me by these very people. One hot summer afternoon, I was at the river's edge getting water, and I heard voices in the distance, so I kept my guard up. I finished getting my water and was heading back to my camp when I heard a group of people arguing on the other side of the river. Curious, I hid and watched. There was a dilapidated tent set up, and next to it, 3 men and 1 woman were screaming at each other. They were too far away for me to hear them clearly, and they all looked drunk, stumbling as they argued. I stayed for about 10 minutes, and then one of the men used a beer bottle to hit another in the head. The one who was hit stumbled and fell to the ground. I waited for the man to get up, but he didn't move. The attacker picked up a large rock and threw it down on the man on the ground, not once but 3 times until he was exhausted. I had to stifle a scream as I witnessed this horror, too scared to move. The woman yelled something at the man, hitting him in the chest, but he didn't flinch, just staring at the scene he had created. After a minute, the others yelled something, and then the group ran off together. I finally caught my breath, but still didn't dare to move, afraid they would come back. I stayed hidden for hours, until I was sure they were gone. I thought the man on the ground would get up, but I know now that was a silly thought. I had the insane notion that I had to find a way to help him. Drunk or not, he was still a human being. I ran the 3 miles back to our apartment. For some reason, I was relieved to find my father home. I burst in, out of breath, screaming for my parents. They were on the couch. My father told me to be quiet and asked what was wrong. I told him what I had just witnessed in the woods. Instead of trying to help, my father berated me for not listening to him. My mother, drunk, joined in, and both of them started yelling at me. The worst part was when my mother accused me of making up the story for attention. I denied it, but she wouldn't listen. It ended the way it always did. My father took off his belt, hitting me until I cried, then told me to be quiet, that he would give me something to cry about. The conversation ended, and the man didn't get help. After all, I was just a stupid kid. I limped to my room, crying until I fell asleep, just like all the other times. My trips to the woods were over. I wasn't allowed to leave the house without my parents, and going outside was out of the question. It wasn't long after that I was sent to live with my grandfather, because I became a burden to my parents. I thought life would be the same or worse, since there must have been a reason my mother was so messed up. I was always on my guard, waiting for the first beating. But instead, I was given a life I never dreamed of. My grandpa Mac turned out to be a loving and patient person, the complete opposite of every adult I had ever met. The first time he asked me what I liked to do, I was stunned because nobody had ever cared. I choked back tears, telling him about my love for nature, preparing for the ridicule. But instead, his face lit up. He spent hours telling me stories about his own camping memories with his father. I knew I had become the luckiest kid in the world. When spring came, we spent every waking moment hiking in the woods and parks all over the country. The knowledge he passed on could fill a library. Even though he's now too old to join me, I still visit him often, sharing my amazing adventures. While his body is weak, his mind is still sharp. I owe him more than I can ever repay. It wasn't for another 3 or 4 years that I had the courage to tell him the story from the woods and my guilt for keeping it a secret. At first, he was silent. Then he unexpectedly gave me a big hug. When I asked him what to do, he told me to contact the police back home and tell them everything. After that, the responsibility would no longer be mine, and I wouldn't have to feel guilty anymore. I contacted the police, and the guilt was washed away. As I grew older, I realized my parents were the ones who were wrong. I had done the right thing, and if they chose not to act on it, that was on them. I went to college, and when I came home for Christmas, my grandfather told me that the people responsible had been found, although only the woman was still alive. She led the police to the man's remains. They thanked me for the tip, which helped them solve the case after all those years. I put the horrible memory behind me until recently when my father passed away, bringing back old memories. My love for the woods and the creatures in them has now become my career. I get to travel all over the country, exploring and preserving wild lands before they are gone, something I never dreamed of as a kid stuck in a dumpy apartment in New Jersey. Without my grandfather's love, understanding, and lessons, none of that would have been possible. The arguments always started the same way. My father would declare, "I will never die in a national park full of fat RV driving tourists." He liked to go old school, a polite way of describing his refusal of anything not made of canvas or leather. He saw anything modern as new age bullshit. My mom tried on several occasions to introduce him to things like nylon tents, but he wouldn't budge. He'd rather haul his heavy, musty wall tin around, along with his leaky kerosene cans that made a mess of everything. The phrase roughing it was definitely coined with him in mind. We endured his archaic ways of experiencing nature until an incident that almost claimed my brother's life made him realize the error of his ways. Throughout the early 1980s, my father would drag our family out to a national forest for Thanksgiving. The weather was fairly mild then, and the trees were breathtakingly beautiful. I can still remember the aroma of the pines. These trips would coincide with hunting season for some reason. I've heard that my dad used to be a hunter before he met my mom, but she forbade him from continuing, so this was likely his way of sticking it to her. Either way, the sound of gunfire near the camp was a regular occurrence. Since my parents grew up with very little supervision, my brother Mike's and my childhood were very similar. No one thought that letting two little boys play in the woods among a bunch of trigger-happy hunters was a danger. It was normal for us. Early in the morning, Mike and I would leave the camp, playing all morning until lunch, and then we'd go back out until dinner. We've been doing this since we were very little, and no one ever cared. During one particular Thanksgiving, we had been running and crawling through the bushes all day. At the time, movies like G.I. Joe and Rambo were very popular. Mike and I loved dressing up in camouflage and pretending to play war. It had been a few days since Mike's birthday, and he was given a pair of G.I. Joe walkie-talkies. In retrospect, they were cheap, but we loved them. After lunch, we returned to the woods. I don't remember exactly what I was doing, but I know Mike was trying to sneak up on me. I was sitting on a fallen log when I heard a loud bang, followed by a sound that whistled over my head. I instantly dropped to the ground, waiting for another shot. I wasn't sure what was happening, but my gut told me to stay put. Less than 30 seconds later, I heard a whimper in the distance. Since I couldn't see Mike, I called out to him on the walkie-talkie, but there was no answer. A new sound came through, as if someone was calling my name. I called Mike again, and still no response. I started to get scared. With no other choice, I yelled Mike's name, telling him the game was over, and he needed to answer. I wasn't sure if he was trying to trick me, or if he was in real danger. I listened closely, but only heard a gentle rustling of leaves. I went toward the sound, stopped, listened, and called again. The rustling repeated, just to my right, very close. I couldn't see anything, so I dropped to the ground, looking at the base of the ground. About 3 feet away, I saw the sole of a Nike shoe. I knew it was Mike's. I ran to the bush where he was. The sight I saw breaks my heart to this day. Mike looked at me with a panicked look, and just below his arm was a gushing wound. I was shocked, but I tried to stay calm so I wouldn't scare him more. Had I been older, I would have known how to move him more safely, but at the time, I just bent down and picked him up. He was too heavy for me, but I was determined to save him. I carried him for about 100 yards before I was exhausted and had to put him down. He was in pain, his voice faint, telling me to leave him and go get help. I fought back tears, running for a mile without stopping. My mom must have known something was wrong, screaming for my dad in a panic. My dad came out of the tent, looked at me, and asked, "How bad is it?" I was too out of breath to speak, just pointing in Mike's direction. My dad took off running. By the time I caught up, my dad had already picked up Mike and was heading for the camp. On the way to the hospital, my mom kept talking to Mike, telling him to hold on. I was in the back seat, holding a shirt to his wound. The ride that should have taken 30 minutes took less than 20. My dad handed Mike off to the doctors. He was in surgery within the hour. The next 3 hours were a prolonged nightmare. I was in shock from what happened, but I was also amazed by how calm my parents were. It wasn't until I became a parent myself that I realized they weren't calm at all, just trying to stay in control. After midnight, the doctors told us that Mike had been critical. I learned later that he had died a few times on the table, but that he had a chance for a full recovery. The police were notified about the shooting, arriving early in the morning to ask questions. With all the urgency gone, I broke down several times while retelling the story. It was the first time I realized I could have been shot as well. Mike was in the hospital for a few weeks, so my parents rented a hotel room nearby. My dad had thought about staying at the camp, but after a short conversation with my mom, he decided to abandon that idea. The detectives kept us updated, but by the time Mike was released from the hospital, no one had been officially identified as a suspect. The most popular theory was that a poacher mistook movement in the bushes for a deer and fired. This was reinforced when hunting licenses were checked, but this wasn't the first time this has happened, and sadly, it won't be the last. Mike was lucky to have survived. 34 years have passed, and no one has ever been officially connected to the shooting. Mike made a full recovery, went on to start his own company and raise a family, just like any other person. One good thing came from the incident. We never went back to the national forest. Furthermore, my dad decided that among the fat RV driving tourists, that environment was safer for the family. From ages 12 to 17, I got to spend my vacations in places like Yosemite and the Grand Canyon. That's how I always thought camping should be, peaceful and quiet. I believe Mike would agree with me. I'm not sure who came up with the idea first, but by the end of the day, we had our destination and a departure date. I had been camping many times before, but I'm pretty sure neither Chuck nor Glenn had. They were my adopted younger brothers who came into my family later in life, after my biological father passed away. My stepfather was a wonderful person, but he was not an outdoorsman. We put together a packing list for the trip and followed it strictly, including 4 cases of beer, arguably the most important of all the items. We loaded up the car and were ready to go early the next morning. The 3-hour drive was smooth and quiet. I was pleased to see that the area was dry. Building a fire was not my strong suit, though not a difficult task, and I knew neither Chuck nor Glenn had ever built a fire other than lighting a cigarette. I had brought a little lighter fluid just in case, but it turned out not to be needed. While I worked on the fire, Chuck and Glenn were using their YouTube knowledge to set up the tent. I had purposely gotten the easiest one to set up, and it still took them almost an hour. By the time they were done, the fire was roaring. I buried the potatoes in the coals, prepped the steak, and was on my second beer. The steak cooked quickly, and as darkness set in, we sat down for a good meal. After dinner, the real camping started. There was a reason I chose a secluded area to camp. I knew we would be loud and obnoxious once we got drunk, and I like building big fires and playing loud music. You can't do that when other people are around. That night was a lot of fun. We drank 2 full cases of beer and didn't fall asleep until the sun was coming up. It was something I had needed to do for a long time, and even with a hangover, I decided that we would do it more often. When I crawled out of my sleeping bag, it was well past noon. Chuck and Glenn were already awake, sitting next to the cold fire, each holding a beer, and they looked happy to see me. I asked why the fire was out, and Chuck mumbled something about not being able to get it going again, which made me laugh. I went to the edge of the trees, grabbed a bundle of firewood, came back and placed it on the cold coals and blew on them. They flared up, and the fire was roaring again in a few minutes. Then I went to the stream to get water. The look of astonishment on their faces was funny to see. Chuck's jaw dropped, and I could tell Glenn wanted to ask me how I did it. While the water was boiling, I cooked a huge meal of eggs and potatoes, and we ate breakfast with coffee. After eating, I felt a lot better and suggested we go fishing. We didn't get back to camp until it was almost dark. Unfortunately, no one caught a fish big enough to keep, but I could tell that Chuck had caught a pretty good buzz. I cooked the rest of the steak, and after that, we proceeded to drink the rest of the beer. That night was more low-key than the previous one. I didn't want to build a huge fire, as it would be hard to put it out completely before we left. Most of the time, the three of us talked about trivial things like girls and work. At about 2 a.m., we decided to go to bed with the beer long gone. My last memory is of Chuck going outside to pee. He had drunk more than Glenn and I, so he stumbled a few times as he tried to get out of his sleeping bag, but he eventually made it out of the tent. I must have fallen asleep right after that. The next thing I knew, the sun was starting to peek through the trees. I had to pee badly, so I fumbled with the tent zipper, trying not to wake the other two up. As I opened the tent, a smell of something burning, like burnt meat, hit me. I thought one or both of them were up and were burning breakfast. I looked back and saw that only Glenn was still sleeping. It must be Chuck cooking, and he was a terrible cook. I crawled out of the tent, smiling, ready to deliver a jab at him. But when I looked up, I didn't see Chuck burning food. What I saw was far more serious and horrific. The fire was out, and Chuck wasn't there. The sunrise was still faint, and I couldn't make out the large object draped across a corner of the cold coals. I took a few steps closer, and the smell of burning flesh became stronger. Then, suddenly, I realized what I was looking at. Chuck was face down on a corner of the cold fire pit, not moving. Without thinking, I grabbed him and turned him over. All I saw was black and the horrible smell of burning flesh. I screamed for Glenn, and when he didn't immediately answer, I ran into the tent, shaking him hard. He reluctantly woke up, but when I screamed in his face that Chuck is dead, he shot up, demanding that I repeat myself. I pointed to the fire and the horrifying scene that the sunlight was making clearer by the minute. Glenn ran out of the tent, almost face to face with the charred body of our brother. I stood behind him, my eyes shut tight. Glenn got on his knees, screaming and crying. At that moment, I wanted to be anywhere but there. The sound of Glenn's gut-wrenching screams, mixed with a horrible smell in the air, was worse than any nightmare I had ever imagined. A cold gust of wind blew by, and I realized I was so scared that I had wet myself. But that didn't matter. The scene was becoming clearer by the minute, and I was too terrified to open my eyes. I didn't want to remember Chuck this way. I crawled back into the tent, sobbing for what seemed like an eternity, until I thought I should call 911. The police and detectives arrived about an hour and a half later. When the coroner took Chuck's body away, I finally had the courage to come out. Glenn was talking to one of the police officers. The smell of burnt flesh was still so strong that I threw up and had to retreat to the tent. Another officer came into the tent, asking me about the trip and the events of the night before, but nothing was unusual. After about 20 minutes, he left with his colleagues. I started to pack up the camp, and Glenn soon joined in. We worked in silence. I worked as fast as I could, just wanting to get away from the horrible smell of my brother's burnt flesh. In retrospect, I might have seemed cold, but I was the oldest, and it was my responsibility to tell the family. I knew my mother would be devastated, and I wanted to tell her before the news got out. Telling my mother was exactly as I had imagined, horrible. She had always dreamed of a big family. When my biological father passed away, she thought that dream was over. But when she met my stepfather and he mentioned adoption, she was beyond overjoyed. Chuck and Glenn were biological brothers 2 years apart and were in their early teens when my mother adopted them. Boys at that age are typically hard to place in adoptions, but my mother fell in love with them at first sight. I had always considered them my real brothers, as did the rest of the family. Glenn and I stayed close to my mother for a while, knowing that Chuck's death was affecting her badly. It was also the first time I had felt suspicion from Glenn. He didn't say anything, but I caught his probing gaze several times that month. As time went on, more questions were asked, more than I care to mention. I had always assumed Chuck got drunk, fell into the fire and died. He drank more than us. But the coroner's report showed a few unusual things. For instance, Chuck's back was covered in bruises. For what it's worth, Chuck played football with his friends at school for years, so that could be explained. However, his skull was fractured, a worrying sign. But even the doctor admitted that in a fire, the skull could fracture from the heat. As horrible as the truth was, these details cemented the suspicion in Glenn's mind. Even though I tried to convince him that this was not the time to be apart, Glenn seemed to believe that I was involved in Chuck's death. I also had my own suspicions about Glenn and his relationship with Chuck. I had seen them argue, but they always stopped when I came around. However, now was not the time to fracture the family. My mother needed us more than ever. If she found out about the animosity between us, not only would it break her heart, but she might not be able to handle it. For the foreseeable future, I will do my best to keep the family together. If not for my mother, then for Chuck. Alone, I will continue to dig into the rift between the two brothers, and whether it led to Chuck's death. No matter how painful the truth is, I owe it to Chuck. After all, he was my brother, too. I work at a summer camp in the northeastern United States, which operates from late June to early August each year. It's an overnight camp where staff and campers arrive on Sunday afternoons and leave on Friday evenings each week. For the duration of the week, we live in isolation at the camp, which has numerous cabins for sleeping, a large dining hall for meals, and about 10 other buildings, from large single-story centers to small storage sheds. The entire camp spans 4 acres, which are beautiful in a very green, woodsy way, typical of the Northeast in the summer. There's a wide-open field woods, a huge pond filled with fish, and a beautiful long ravine with exposed slate and lots of wildlife. The camp is set far back from the main roads, with a long road leading in, giving it the feel of its own self-contained universe. Campers are not allowed to have electronics, and staff are only allowed to use them at night or during breaks. There are no computers, no cars, and very little contact with the outside world, save for what is necessary for the camp director. Staff carry walkie-talkies to stay in contact across the wide grounds. I have been coming to this camp since I was a small child for 10 years and have worked there for 4 years. I love the place, but anyone who has worked there knows it has a long and complicated history with paranormal activity. I could write a book on the stories I have been told and my own personal experiences over the summers. I want to give a general overview of what it's like to work there and share a few of the most chilling experiences that still give me goosebumps, even though I've become somewhat accustomed to them. Most of the events happen at night, either during training week or after the kids have gone to bed. Campers rarely experience the entities that lurk in the woods, but I have no idea why. As a child, my memories of camp are devoid of any fear or anything unexplainable. But as an adult counselor, I was frequently on the verge of tears from the bizarre things. Each year, certain phenomena happen without fail. During training week or after the kids are asleep, counselors often lie outside near the dining hall, stargazing to unwind. From there, we have a clear view of the constellations, the athletic field, and the far hills. Many nights, we would see flashing lights that moved in unusual ways, unannounced meteor showers, and often see red flickering objects deep in the night sky. These were not planets, as they were in the wrong position and only appeared one night out of the week. I had a few friends who were well versed in the solar system, and they were often left scratching their heads, insisting that what we saw was impossible, even with more than 10 witnesses. Counselors rarely made it through a summer without having nightmares, typically of shadowy figures standing in the corner of their cabins or at the end of their beds. I had these nightmares every year, except for my first year working. I would wake up in a cold sweat, while the kids slept peacefully. Screams and voices in the night would echo from the pond into the camp, footsteps would go around the buildings with no one there, and objects would go missing only to appear in a nonsensical place. All very common. Doors with huge locks would sometimes be found wide open, with no one taking credit for it. Sometimes a counselor would get locked in the building they were working in, even though there was nobody else nearby to lock the door. Some people came in as skeptics but left as believers in the paranormal. Seasoned staff had to learn to accept these mysterious things and warn the new people. My first memory of paranormal activity at the camp was in 2014 when I was training for my first year as a counselor. As a child, I remember there being a flat tombstone on the hill that led down to the camp pool, just outside the girls' village, where the female campers and counselors sleep. The tombstone was so old that the name and dates were unreadable, but the lettering was laid out to look like someone's grave. No one could explain why it was there. Everyone just said it had been there since before their time. That year, there was a lot of paranormal drama, but I was too young and not close enough with the older counselors for them to confide in me. By the end of the year, the tombstone was removed, and no one was allowed to mention it if a camper asked. I figured, even though the tombstone was gone, someone was still buried under that hill, albeit a very long time ago. Perhaps the management thought removing the tombstone would end the paranormal activity, but they were wrong. During training week in June 2014, my friends and I started telling spooky stories, and the older counselors joined in to mess with us. Note, all counselors at the camp were given nicknames during their first year, and we went by those names all summer to make the campers feel more at home. I will be using those nicknames in my story. An older counselor named Gadget told a story about two of the camp's most famous ghosts. The first was the ghost of a little boy who could be seen running across the athletic field in the streetlights on the dead-end road next to the camp. Gadget said the boy was hit by a car while chasing a ball and now spent his afterlife running as a phantom, scaring anyone who was still awake. The second story was about a woman in a white dress who stood on the porch of a house on the dead-end road. She would stand watching the camp all night and disappear as the sun came up. We, the first-year counselors, were terrified. It was well past midnight, and we were gathered under the bright lights of the pavilion near the field and dead-end road. Luckily, another older counselor, Slag, who would later become one of my best friends, shook his head, a look of annoyance on his face at how scared we were. That night, Slag took me to the top of the hill overlooking the field and the dead-end road. He pointed out that the little boy was just the shadow of an electrical box on a light pole, which created the shape of a running child. The woman in the white dress was a huge American flag on the porch of the house, which would flutter in the wind, looking like a dress in the moonlight. I let out a sigh of relief, but Slag remained serious. He said that while those things were just coincidences, we were not alone out here. He told me about the same strange things I had described, which put me on edge again. That night, Slag and I slept on the same cot out of our newfound fear. One of the spookiest places at the camp was the building we called Day Camp, which held a program for smaller campers who were dropped off and picked up during the day. It was the only two-story building, having been a house before the camp was built in 1925. The main room had huge windows, through which the setting sun would stream, and a still working but old kitchen. The upper level was an attic-like space, used for activities when it rained. Day camp was located the farthest away, requiring a walk through a section of woods and a rocky trail to get to, and it was typically impossible to hear people from there, which says a lot when there were 300 loud kids a week. Day camp always gave me a bad feeling, like something out of the Blair Witch Project. I tried not to go there alone, but sometimes I had to be the one to close it up by myself. Every time, my body would be tense, as if something were pressing on my skin. When I turned my back on the empty rooms, I had the sensation of being watched by an invisible crowd. The boys' village was closest to Day Camp, but unless the lights were on, the building almost blended in with the dark woods. Day Camp closed at 4 p.m. after the campers left, with all rooms checked, lights turned off, and doors locked until morning. But the male counselors would say that every summer, 1 or 2 times a week, after the kids were asleep, someone would see the lights in Day Camp on through the woods. It wasn't someone who forgot to turn them off. Sometimes the very person who closed up for the day saw them on. Counselors would take turns walking the dark trail to turn off the lights, only to come back shaking, swearing they would never do it again. My own personal experience with Day Camp happened in the summer of 2016, during a missing camper drill. This was an exercise to prepare for a child running away scared. A random counselor was chosen to be the missing camper, and everyone was given a section of walkie-talkie and would run all over the camp, calling out the name, checking under and around structures, even locked buildings. The camp director would purposely try to throw people off by unlocking doors and moving things. I was assigned to check day camp by myself. As I ran through the woods to the building, I felt a deep sense of fear, so much so that I almost didn't check it. With shaky hands, I unlocked the door, going through the interior, calling out the name of Swift, my friend who was playing the missing camper. The wooden floor creaked under my feet, and the whole building was eerily silent, save for the sound of my footsteps. The sun was setting, and the faint orange light streamed through the windows, making the whole place feel uncanny compared to the bustling parts of the camp. I couldn't hear the other counselors, even though I tried to listen. Every room, every corner I checked, I was prepared to come face to face with the ghosts of my nightmares. The things I'd heard walking on the gravel in the middle of the night, whispering in the dark, scaring grown men. Luckily, the building was empty. I let out a sigh of relief, locked the door, and went back outside. It was getting cold, and I was hoping the drill would end soon, as searching in the dark was almost impossible. I knew Swift wouldn't want to be hiding in the dark either. As I passed the outdoor cellar door that led to day camp's basement, I checked the lock. It was still secure. I was told to continue checking my section until Swift was found. As I turned back through the bushes, I was stunned to see the cellar door wide open, a yellow light emanating from it, highlighting the darkness around it. In my 3 years of working there, I had no idea the cellar door could be open or that a key existed for it, or that there were working lights down there. I called out Swift's name, but there was no response. A cold shiver of fear ran through me. I crept to the top of the cellar stairs, looking down. A bare bulb in the ceiling illuminated 6 or 7 rotting wooden steps and old, cracked stone walls. The floor was dirt, and there were no objects. My walkie-talkie came to life with the announcement that Swift had been found, making me jump back. I looked at the strange sight in front of me for another minute, then ran to the main part of the camp. When I arrived, I found my friend, Amino, also in a state of panic, saying that she had found a maintenance shed door shaking violently, even though it was locked and no one was inside. She thought Swift was trapped, but when she opened it, the shed was empty. No one could explain it. I asked the senior counselors if anyone had opened the day camp cellar door for the drill, but they all shook their heads. Swift was found on the other side of the camp, near the pond, nowhere near day camp. Everyone was shocked, but not surprised. We knew we weren't alone. That night, Tanter and I went back to day camp to lock the cellar door. It has not been opened since. In 2017, I worked as a program specialist, and my group of campers chose day camp as their meeting place. I was reluctant, but my friend Wee Joe, who was very sensitive to the paranormal and knew how to communicate with them, was my co-counselor. He confirmed my intuition about day camp, but said that there was almost nowhere at the camp that didn't have a ghost. With him by my side, I slowly relaxed. By the end of the season, the sense of being watched at day camp seemed to disappear, as if something had stopped watching me. I could go on and on with more stories, but I'll leave it at that. Luckily, the ghosts at the camp mean no harm. They like to be seen, to be talked about in stories, adding to the mystique of the camp. I believe they just want to be a part of the history of the place. My grandfather was a camper there as well, and with all the energy, memories in the green woods, the old structures, the ruins, and the secrets, they call this place home. Anyone who comes here learns to respect that. When I was 10 years old, I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. A year later, my doctor recommended a special summer camp for kids with diabetes, where we could learn how to manage our condition while still having fun like regular kids. The camp was in the suburbs, about an hour and a half drive from my house, and lasted for 1 week. As a shy child, I wasn't thrilled with the idea of being away from my family, but my parents thought it was a great opportunity for me to learn to be independent and make friends with kids who were in a similar situation. In the end, I agreed to go, although I was filled with anxiety. The first day at camp was okay. I shared a cabin with 5 other kids, all around my age. The counselors were friendly, always making sure we checked our blood sugar and took our insulin on time. They organized activities like swimming, crafts, and storytelling around the campfire, which helped me feel more comfortable. But there was one counselor, I'll call him Mark, who made me feel uneasy from the start. Mark was about 20 years old, tall and blonde, with a friendly smile that seemed unnatural. He was always close to the kids, especially the shy ones like me, and had a habit of touching our shoulders or backs when he talked. At the time, I didn't think much of it, just felt a bit uncomfortable. By the third day, I started to notice Mark's strange behavior. During lunch in the dining hall, I saw him sitting very close to a boy named Tim, whispering something that made Tim look scared and silent for the rest of the meal. That evening, during a campfire story time, Mark called me to a corner to check my blood sugar. I found it odd because this was normally done in the cabin with the other counselors. When I refused and said I wanted to check with everyone else, he laughed, saying he was just kidding, but the look in his eyes sent a shiver down my spine. I started to avoid him as much as possible. The fourth night was when things got scary. After the kids went to bed, I woke up in the middle of the night needing to use the bathroom. Our cabin was located near a trail that led to the shared bathroom, about 100 meters away. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside, trying to move quickly in the dark. On the way, I heard footsteps behind me, light but distinct, as if someone was deliberately walking quietly. I turned around, shined my flashlight into the woods, but saw no one. Thinking it might be an animal, I continued on, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. When I got to the bathroom, I quickly finished and prepared to head back. But as I stepped out, I saw a figure standing at the edge of my flashlight beam, right at the entrance to the trail. It was Mark. He stood there, saying nothing, just looking at me with that strange smile. My heart pounded, and I stammered, asking what he was doing. He said in a monotone voice that he was just checking in to see if everyone was okay. I didn't believe him, but I didn't know what to do, so I just nodded and tried to walk quickly back to the cabin. When I looked back, he was still there, watching me until I disappeared behind the trees. The next morning, I told another counselor, Sarah, whom I trusted. She looked concerned and promised to talk to the camp director. That entire day, I didn't see Mark, and I heard the counselors whispering that he was called into the office. By evening, the camp director announced that Mark had left the camp for personal reasons. No one explained further, but I heard a few other kids say that Mark had also made them feel uncomfortable, like calling them out alone or asking strange questions about their families. On the last day of camp, I felt a sense of relief knowing Mark was gone, but I couldn't shake the fear from that night. When my parents came to pick me up, I told them, and my mom was furious, demanding to see the camp director. They said the matter had been dealt with and assured them that Mark would not be returning, but they didn't reveal any more details. Later, I heard my parents whispering that there were rumors Mark had been investigated for inappropriate behavior with children at another camp, but I don't know if that was true. Many years passed, and I never returned to that camp. The experience made it difficult for me to trust strangers for a long time, especially in new places. I still love nature, but whenever I think about camping, the image of Mark standing in the dark, watching me with his cold smile, still gives me a chill. I just hope no other child had to go through that feeling. When my best friend, Amy, and I were 8 years old, Amy's mom took us to a local campground for a summer weekend. It was our first time camping without our parents, and we were both very excited. The campground was about a 20-minute drive from town, a small place with plots for tents and trailers, a central area with bathrooms, and a small playground. Amy's mom set up our tent near the playground where a few other kids were running around. She told us not to wander far and promised to come back for us the next morning. We spent the whole day playing, making friends with the other kids, and exploring the area around our tent. Everything was fun, with the smell of smoke from the campfires and the sound of children's laughter echoing. When it got dark, Amy's mom came back to check on us, bringing some grilled hamburgers and reminding us to go to bed early. After she left, we crawled into our tent, turned on our flashlights, and told each other scary stories, purposely trying to frighten each other. But soon we got tired and fell asleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange noise, like a twig snapping or someone stepping on gravel near our tent. I nudged Amy awake, whispering that something was outside. She rubbed her eyes, listened, and we heard slow footsteps, as if someone was walking in circles around our tent. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter, my heart pounding. Amy, braver than me, tiptoed to the tent door and unzipped it slightly to peek outside. She immediately zipped it back up, her face pale, whispering that there was a man standing a few feet from the tent, staring right at us. We sat there motionless, holding each other, trying not to make a sound. The footsteps continued slowly, as if the man was circling the tent to check on it. After a few minutes, the sound stopped, but we were too scared to check. Then a deep, raspy voice came from right outside the tent. "Hey, little girls, come out and play with me." The voice sent a chill down my spine. Amy squeezed my hand tightly, shaking her head violently, signaling for me to stay quiet. We heard him lightly tapping on the tent, as if he were trying to find a way in. I wanted to scream, but Amy covered my mouth, whispering that we had to stay calm. The tapping stopped, and we heard the footsteps fade away. But just as we thought he was gone, the voice came again, this time from the other side of the tent. "I have some candy. Come on out. I won't hurt you." This time, his voice sounded more impatient. I started to cry silently, while Amy grabbed her flashlight, holding it tightly like a weapon. We didn't know what to do, only that we couldn't go outside. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps came again, this time fading away, heading towards the trailer parking area. We sat there, holding each other, until the sun came up. When the sun rose, we gathered our courage to open the tent door and look outside. No one was there, but we saw footprints in the dirt all around our tent, clearly from an adult. Amy, despite her fear, ran to the campground office to report it. The manager, a kind old man, looked very concerned when he heard our story. He called the police and went to check the area. When Amy's mom came to pick us up, she was horrified to hear the story and hugged us tightly. The police arrived and searched the campground, especially the trailer area. They found a man living in an old trailer who matched our description. Tall, wearing a dirty jacket, and with a deep voice. He claimed he was just taking a walk at night and knew nothing about our tent, but the police found a bag of candy in his trailer, making his story suspicious. They didn't have enough evidence to arrest him, but they told him to leave the campground immediately. Amy's mom never let us go back to that campground. Years later, I heard rumors that the man had been investigated for suspicious behavior with children at another campground, but I don't know the details. This story haunted Amy and me throughout our childhood. Although we are still best friends, we never talk about that night. Every time I see a campground or hear footsteps in the night, I remember that creepy voice and the feeling of sheer terror knowing that only a thin layer of canvas separated us from danger. When I was 15, my 3 friends, Lisa, Emma, and Sarah, and I decided to go camping for the first time without adult supervision. We chose a campground about a 45-minute drive from town, located in a dense forest with trails leading to a small lake. It was a popular spot for families, so we figured it was safe enough for a group of 4 teenage girls. Lisa's parents agreed to drop us off and set up our tent, on the condition that we call them every evening. We brought an old mobile phone, the kind that only made calls and sent texts, along with food, flashlights, and a few decks of cards for entertainment. The first day was wonderful. We hiked, swam in the lake, and laughed all afternoon. When the sun went down, we built a small fire, roasted marshmallows, and told spooky stories, trying to scare each other. As it got completely dark, we crawled into our tent, a large one big enough for all 4 of us, and continued talking late into the night. At about 1 a.m., we decided to go to sleep, turned off our flashlights, and got into our sleeping bags. I was half asleep when I was woken by a strange sound, like the rustling of leaves and the gentle snapping of twigs, right outside our tent. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, as the area had a lot of wildlife. But the sound wasn't random. It was rhythmic, like the footsteps of a person walking slowly around the tent. I sat up, my heart racing, and nudged Lisa, who was sleeping next to me. She opened her eyes, whispering what was wrong. I signaled for her to be quiet and listen. At this point, Emma also woke up, and all three of us clearly heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the tent in a perfect circle. Sarah, the bravest of the group, whispered that it might just be another camper going to the bathroom or checking the campground. But as we listened more closely, the footsteps stopped right in front of the tent door, and we heard another sound, heavy, low, and deep breathing. None of us dared to move. I felt a cold sweat run down my back, and Lisa squeezed my hand so hard it hurt. Emma started to shake, trying to hold back a sob. We sat there, motionless, waiting for something to happen. After a few minutes of terrifying silence, the footsteps started again, this time moving even slower, as if the person was purposely drawing out the moment. Suddenly, we heard a light scratching on the tent fabric, like fingernails or a finger gliding across it. Sarah, despite her fear, mustered up all her courage and yelled, "Who's there? Go away, we're trying to sleep." The scratching stopped, but there was no reply. Instead, the footsteps quickened, circling the tent a few more times before fading away into the woods. We heard the rustling of leaves get fainter, and then everything was silent. None of us slept for the rest of the night. We huddled together, clutching our sleeping bags, with our flashlights on, waiting for morning. When the first light of dawn appeared, Sarah and I cautiously went outside to check. We found large footprints, clearly from an adult, in the dirt around our tent, forming a nearly perfect circle. What was even more terrifying was that there were a few small scratch marks on the tent fabric, as if someone had been trying to test its durability. We didn't see anyone around the campground, and the nearest plots were quite far from ours, so it was unlikely that another camper had accidentally wandered by. We quickly packed up our stuff, put out the fire, and called Lisa's mom to pick us up early. When she arrived, we told her the story, and she looked very concerned. She took us to the campground office to report it. The manager said that sometimes transients wander into the woods from nearby areas, but they had never received a report of such behavior. He promised to notify the police and increase night patrols. The police arrived, took down our story, and checked the area, but they didn't find any trace of anyone. They advised us not to camp alone anymore, at least not until we were older. After that incident, none of the four of us ever went back to that campground. We still went camping together a few more times, but only when we had adults with us or in more crowded areas. The feeling of being watched that night still haunts me. I don't know who that person was or what they wanted, but the thought that only a thin layer of canvas separated us from them makes me never want to camp without protection again. Every time I hear a twig snap in the night, I remember the slow, rhythmic footsteps circling our tent, and I wonder if we were ever as safe as we thought.